Hello and welcome. In today's video I'm going to show you how to make these little coasters. They're very useful for using up those leftover pieces of fabric, and you can use very small pieces to make them. So the bits that you probably think you haven't got a use for, you'll be able to use those up. Tiny little pieces like these are the sort of things that you can use. And you can also use up your leftover or your scraps of interfacing, and a couple of these I've used fusible fleece on, so you could use some fusible fleece if you have some tiny bits. Anyway, let's get started and make a coaster.
You'll need to cut a strip of fabric on the bias, so you'll need to cut it at a 45-degree angle. So I don't know whether you can see, but at the side I've got my 45-degree line with my straight edge of my fabric, so that means that I'll be cutting a 45-degree angle strip. The strip needs to be 1.5 inches wide and about 14 inches long. It does depend a little bit on what size coaster you make, but I cut mine 14 inches long, and that was to go around a 3 3/4 inch round coaster. For the stabiliser, I'm using fusible fleece, but you could use an interfacing. So I draw around my sellotape to get a nice round circle, and then I cut out the circle. You'll need to find a small piece of cotton fabric for your base, and then you need to attach your interfacing or fusible fleece to your base, following the manufacturer's instructions. My instructions are to iron under a damp cloth, but I actually find it works quite well just spraying the fabric and then ironing. I place my iron in one place and hold it down for a few seconds before moving on to another place. Then I cut around the fabric to make it the same size as the fusible fleece or interfacing. You could cut your fabric out first, it doesn't really matter, whichever way you find easiest, but I just thought it'd be easier to do it this way. Then sort through your scraps of fabric to find suitable pieces. You can use very small pieces for this. It's quite useful for getting rid of your very small pieces of fabric you can't use for much else. You know, they're 1 inch by 2 inches maybe. Anyway, the best way to do it is to just lay a few pieces of fabric out on your bases and see how it looks before actually pinning any. When you're happy with the layout, you can pin the first couple of pieces down. So start with the first piece facing right side up, and the piece that's going to lie next to it face on top of it right side down, and put a pin in it. You can also pin a piece to the opposite side of the first piece. So again, with right sides facing on the opposite side, pin another piece in place. That way you can sew 2 pieces at once. So sew down one side, back tacking at the start and the finish, and taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and obviously remove any pins as you go along. And then sew down the other side, again taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, removing any pins, back tacking at the start and the finish. Then give a quick press with a nice hot iron, and then you can find your next piece or pieces of fabric to pin in place. I'm only going to do one this time, so I find where I want to put it and I place it down with right sides facing, and then pin in place. Then sew in place, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. Then I place the next piece of fabric where I'd like it to go, again with right sides facing, and then I sew, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then add the next piece to the opposite side, again right sides facing, and pin in place, and then sew, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then give it all a good press. Next, very carefully trim off all the edges to match them to your base. So cut around the circle very carefully, making sure that your strips of fabric match with your base. Take the bias tape that we cut earlier and fold it in half down the centre to mark the middle. Take one of the sides and fold it to the centre line that we have just marked. So you should be folding down a 1/4 inch. Fold it down and iron in place. Then fold the other side to meet it in the centre and of course iron. Then we attach our binding tape to the coaster. Don't start right at the start of the tape, leave about 1 inch to 1.25 inches at the end, and then start pinning the rest of your tape around the coaster. Use as many pins as you like because it is a little bit tricky. Try not to stretch the binding too much and go around the edges very carefully because we want to create a curve. That's why we've cut the tape on the bias, so we can create this curve. So keep pinning all the way around until you get to about 2 inches or 2.5 inches where we started from. And we're going to leave that bit open for now. We'll come to that later. Next, starting at the first pin that we put in, sew all the way, well, not all the way around, but most of the way around our circle, taking the pins out as we go along, and you're taking 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that means you're going to be sewing on the fold that you turned over. If you remember, when you first folded the bias tape, you folded it in half and then folded each side into the centre. So it's one of those side lines that you're sewing on. So it's a bit of a guide to make sure you're keeping. I'm sorry my hands are in the way quite a lot here, but I have to keep removing the pins. Anyway, keep going until you get to that last pin that you put in, and then you're going to back tack and stop, and then we will join the 2 pieces together. But we're going to do that away from the sewing machine. So just sew till you get to that last pin and then stop and back tack. You should have a gap of about 2 inches where you've not sewn. So I put a pin roughly in the middle of this just to mark the centre, and then I fold each side around to this pin and put a mark where it meets the pin, and I do this with each side. So I gradually fold the edge round where I'm going to be pinning it to the pin and then put a mark. I'm just using a pencil because nobody's going to see it. And then I can pin with right sides together, and with the tape open I can pin together, matching up these marks I've just made. It's a little bit tricky, but match the 2 marks up and then put a couple of pins in to hold it in place, and then we can sew this together at the sewing machine. Sew the 2 sides of bias tape together at the sewing machine, back tacking at the start and the finish, and removing your pin. Then trim this seam to about 1/4 inch, and I'm just going to finger press this open, and then we can attach it to our coaster. So just using my fingers, I'm just going to press it open, and then I'll attach it or pin it to the side of the coaster, and it should fit nicely because we measured it all out. So put a couple of pins in and then we'll sew it in place. Then sew the gap closed, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance as before, back tacking at the start and the finish, and removing those pins as we go along. Next, turn the binding tape the right side out. So gently push our coaster out into the corners and pull the binding over the top. Then fold 1/4 inch under. This again should be marked from when we folded our bias in the beginning. So fold it all over and then fold it again, and press your edges under with your iron, and then pin in place, ready for hand stitching. We're going to hand stitch around this because I think it's probably the easiest way to do it. And then on the back we're going to hand stitch the bias tape in place. So put a knot in your thread, obviously thread your needle first, put a knot in it, and we're going to do a whip stitch. To start the whip stitch, we do our first stitch starting just under the bias tape, so our knot will be enclosed and no one will see it. And then we take a little bit of fabric from the coaster, a little bit of fabric from the tape, always moving forwards. So a little bit from the tape, then going forwards again, we take a little bit from the coaster, and then go a little bit forward again, a little bit from the tape, and forward again, a little bit from the coaster, and keep going like this until we get to the end. And finish by tying a knot in your last stitch. So do your last stitch and through the loop Wrap your needle through it a couple of times, pull it tight, and there's your knot. If you don't like hand stitching or you don't want to hand stitch, you can top stitch on your sewing machine. You need to top stitch on the right side of your fabric, but you've got to make sure that you catch under the binding on the underside. So pin it carefully, making sure that you will catch the binding on the underside.
Thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, could you please like and subscribe to help me grow my channel? Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.